pleasure to get to be here today, and a lot of what I'll be talking about really builds on what we just heard from Danielle. To start things off, though, I want to offer this quotation, which is from a book by John Law called After Method. And Law writes, "Parts of our world are caught in our ethnographies, our histories, and our statistics. But other parts are not, or if they are, then this is because they have been distorted into clarity." And so I'm a bit emboldened by Danielle's work coming before me, and so I'm opening my presentation to a conference on culture, context, and ecologies of mind with this quote about method and knowing in the social sciences. And I'm doing that because I want to develop the thread that Danielle has started here, looking at what it means to do situated neurosciences. And what we heard prior to my talk is two ways that we could think about situatedness methodologically. So situated as in the cultural, historical, and geopolitical context or form, and then also situated as neuroscience and neurology as lived and embodied experience. And so now there we go. So, sorry guys, there we go. And so with this as an entry point, what I'm going to try to do is braid in another way of thinking about what it means to do situated neurosciences. And so I'm going to be talking about situatedness as staying with the messiness, staying with the mess of vague, diffuse, unspecific, slippery, ephemeral, indistinct phenomena in a way that isn't distorting them into clarity, where we actually hold that mess and what kind of methods we use to hold that mess, and holding that mess as a kind of situatedness, and where we actually find new ways of relating to this messiness. So this version of situatedness is going to ask us to look at how technologies of neurosciences might coordinate across time and space, sometimes distorting phenomena to produce knowledge. So cognitive tests and symptom scales, the naming and the spatializing of brain regions, images of brains, as well as the statistical correlations that enable those visualization practices to take place, and the actual people who actually have to make the algorithms that determine signal from noise. The ligands, the mice, these are all contributing to a particular kind of way of making meaning and making bodies. And through this coordination of all of these different things, we tell stories about what neuroscience is and what we know from it. So I want us to pay attention to all of this messiness, the coordination, and what kinds of stories are coming out of it. But what I also want to be able to do is think about how the stories we tell might take seriously the role of networks in signaling mice and ligands as ways of explaining the materiality of our experiences without collapsing the entirety of our experiences into these same processes. So when I say we're going to think about what it means to do situated neurosciences that stays with the messiness, I want to be able to attend to the ways in which this is a field of science that is world-making, but without reducing this world-making solely to an objective critique. So I'm trying to sort of find a way to engage and make with the neurosciences. Now there's some trouble to this, and there's some trouble to the way that I approach this, because the conventional neuroscientific practices and practitioners don't generally see themselves as creating a kind of story. They would see themselves generally to be showing the world as it is. So what I want to do then is also explore methodological possibilities for making with neurosciences in a way that keeps track of the onto-epistemological mess. And then in doing that, and in saying that this is a way of doing that, how we do it, it brings up a couple of other questions. So one question is, what does it mean to think about science as telling stories? And then the question that follows from that is it really possible to hold these different ways of storying experience simultaneously? And these two kinds of questions that are prompted from the way that I'm approaching this really kind of speak to that. Can we do a making with? And if we're sort of understanding this as stories, is that going to work? Now, framing what I'm talking about in terms of staying with the mess is both a nod to Donna Haraway's work. Danielle talked about the classic paper Situated Knowledges, but in my case I'm thinking also about Donna Haraway's work in the book Staying with the Trouble, and then John Law's After Method, which is the epigraph that started off this talk. So that After Method book is about how to stay with the mess in social sciences. So things that are complex, diffuse, and messy need different ways of knowing, and different ways of knowing across temporalities and materialities. And so it's going to think about, I think to do this, it means that we need to think about how to concretely pay attention to the stories that we're telling about the world, and the ways in which these stories themselves are told through and with other stories, worlds, knowledges, and relationships. And so at the outset, I want to identify also that this isn't just a matter of trying to take this perspective or that perspective and switching standpoints. Because, and this is partly where this is a methods paper, what I want to suggest following the work of Dick Willems, that different narratives exist part and parcel with different practices. And that telling a different story or trying to tell different stories together means doing some things and not other things, or doing things very differently compared to how we might be used to doing them within our respective disciplines. And I think that in some ways this conference and the workshop sort of leading into it is about trying to forge some of those interdisciplinary doings. So that's a lot of context and background, but with that in mind, I'm going to sort of dive into an instance now of doing situated neurosciences, where the doing is about having divergent modes of explanation that are articulating with one another, where this doing is generating tensions and negotiations and spaces that are informative. So I sort of think of this as it's creating a kind of friction without foreclosure. So it's these loose ends, the negotiations and the frictions, these are the messy articulations of practice as this different kind of doing neurosciences is happening. And it is one of the ways that I think that we can maintain complexity, simultaneity, and multiplicity within our stories of neuroscience. So let me get into some of the specifics now. So I collaborate on the Situated Neurology project that you heard just a little bit about earlier, which is a sensory, ethnographic, and arts-based research study that aims to understand those sensorial experiences, sometimes considered real, sometimes considered imagined, that are part of the lived experience of brain injury and that escape conventional scientific diagnostics in neurology. And they can often escape the conventional approaches in the social sciences, like ethnography. So these are often imperceptible to frameworks of biomedicine, and they sometimes sit beyond the language of people who experience the altered neurostates. They are forms of sensorial and perceptual perceptual difference, I should say, that have no disciplinary home or explanation. So in the Situated Neurology project, coming to know brain trauma means trying to understand these ephemeral and messy experiences and the ways in which they emerge in the relations between human and non-human actors as they interact with one another. So clinicians, neuroscientists, patients, carers, medical files, neuroimages, clinical scales, all of these interact to shape the landscape of neuroscience and adjacent fields, and in doing so, they're shaping the textures of the experiences themselves. So within the Situated Neurology project, we have an interest in the technologies that construct how brain trauma and brain experiences are known, and understanding these technologies from different experiences. So one of these technologies, and I use the term technologies to refer to things like clinical scales and tools. And so one of these is the Montréal Cognitive Assessment, which you've heard a little bit about through the ethnographic case of patient M. And so I want to turn now to the MoCA to think more about multiple stories and multiple readings as a way of doing situated neurosciences. So the MoCA is a clinician-administered cognitive battery that's composed of different sections that are meant to test a range of overlapping domains of cognitive function: the visual spatial ability, fluency, naming, memory, attention, and executive function. It's created here in Montreal in 1995 and has quickly become a well-utilized technology in many fields of medicine for the assessment in particular of mild cognitive impairment, which can be associated with any number of clinical conditions. It's translated into many different languages, dialects. It has some cultural variations, and it also has, interestingly, a designated training program. And there are a lot of ways in which the variations of the MoCA are very controlled. And so in being able being constructed this way, the MoCA positions itself as a more detailed, subtle, and consistent, reliable technology for carrying out assessments of cognitive impairment, particularly in comparison to the apparatus or the technology that sort of operates as a foil to it, which is the Folstein Mini Mental Status Examination. So if we think about what it looks like to do situated neurosciences, I'm going to use the example of thinking through the MoCA as this third way of doing situated neurosciences. So the first thing that I want to do is to look at, I'm going to go back here, is to look at some of the articulations with the MoCA. And now when I use the term articulation, I'm referring to the ways that a seemingly stable entity or object, like the MoCA, can be constructed through forms of connection or linkage that are themselves the products of particular contexts and histories. So spatial and temporal constructions that are relational and emergent. And so articulations are temporary, contested, partial kinds of practices. They're related to diverse human and non-human actors, and they can appear to be sort of temporarily or provisionally stable, but there is a way in which the articulations often are in flux in that. And so we're interested in thinking about articulation as a kind of method. So one articulation, as I sort of alluded to, is the MoCA's foil, the MMSE. So the MoCA and the MMSE articulate with one another. The MMSE has been critiqued for its not having been copyrighted, which has led to concerns about rogue variations and unapproved adaptations. So in contrast, the MoCA has very specific guidelines for how to do cultural and language adaptations, and it has training and certification programs. The MMSE is also criticized for how its score ranges are narrowed when you look at people with higher levels of education and repeat testing, whereas the MoCA scoring has been positioned as less impacted by these things. So these articulations are part of a story that the MoCA constructs about its reliability, universality, and its attentiveness to the subtle experiences of cognitive impairment. So it's through the MoCA that previously imperceptible body-mind difference that the MMSE was too crude to detect, materializes. So when we look at the MMSE as an articulation, and of course the MMSE has its own history, context, and its own sets of articulations, the MoCA story stabilizes in relation to assessing an emerging neurodifference, particularly amongst those who are clever enough to hide that difference from the MMSE. So as an articulating tool, the MMSE, is too blunt to demarcate difference. And then the MoCA positions itself to capture what before it would have been imperceptible. So in doing so, these forms of the ephemeral are being made present. They're materializing within the context of this technology or this tool. But thinking about the MoCA in terms of these messy articulations, we can see how the presence of neurodifference depends on what has also been made absent and what exceeds the frame of this particular technology. So following kind of this line of thinking about messiness in terms of articulations, we can actually look even further into the MoCA itself. And so the embedded contents of the MoCA are also kinds of articulations here. So you'll see at the top, where it says visuospatial executive, there's some circular forms that have letters and numbers, and there's some dashed lines with arrows. That is the Trails B test, which is one of the components of the MoCA, but it is an articulation that has its own context and history. There's also a blank space that you see on the other side of that top row that says draw clock, 10 past 11, 3 points. The clock drawing test is another type of cognitive testing that has been embedded within the MoCA, and so it's also a kind of articulation. Now, this gives us, I think when we look at these articulations, we can also think about the sense of historical situatedness that particular neuropsychological technologies have. And this adds to the sense of understanding brain injury in multiply storied and sort of polyvocal ways. So both the clock drawing and the Trails B were developed outside of the MoCA itself, and they're tests of space-time that are designed to assess the construct of executive function. In Trails B, the test taker makes a continuous line connecting in ascending order, alternating numbers and letters, and it's assessed against a set of norms around time to completion. The Trails B is this component of the trail-making test, which was originally incorporated as a subtest into the Army Individual Test of General Ability, which situates this test in relation to a string of other inventories and batteries aimed to assess susceptibility to shell shock. But in 1955, its purpose was shifted and actually there's an article that talks about being rechristened to discriminate brain injury and discriminate between brain injured and non-brain injured patients. And so with this history, when we think about this as an articulation as having a historical context, my mind jumps back to patient M and to the presence of the American doctors in Kisumu through the U.S. Army Walter Reed Project. This is a synchronicity across time and across text. When we think about this synchronicity, other insights end up opening up. The MoCA is situated historically and culturally. Its form as a clinical scale enables the one administering it to perform an assessment that is timeless. And so that's fine and good. You might say that there's this interesting history and it's embedded in this thing, but isn't it also the case that the Trails B offers an objective marker of deficit history or not? So what matter does this contingency have? I think that in paying attention to the articulations of the MoCA, we get to peel back the ways that cognitive testing is orienting space-time to precision, linearity, and smooth, continuous movement forward. It's an explicit part of constructing chromonormativity and materializing different kinds of body-mind difference and making meaningful body-mind difference through norms of space-time. And the Trails B as part of the MoCA is making meaning and bodies. And the space-time of the MoCA, then, you could juxtapose, for instance, to, in critical disability studies, a concept called CRIP space-time, which is also connected to critical temporality studies in ways that, and it understands how material discursive practices relating to temporality are part of the ways that we sort body-minds. Instead of linear chromonormative space-time that orients toward a futurity, CRIP space-time, it loops, it slows, it speeds up, it's often layered and relayered, and it can be marked by loss. So the MoCA doesn't tell this CRIP time story except as pathology. And this is the kind of insight that we get by trying to do all of these articulations. There are, you see in the middle panel, images of the animals. This is another kind of articulation that we might notice. These are meant to be low-frequency objects, or so lion, camel, rhino. But of course, they're not universally low frequency. And so in addition to a particular kind of space-time, we also have a particular kind of cultural geographical positioning, which could be adapted, but only in very approved ways. We can think to other ways that something might be situated. And so then we can think about the MoCA in relation to sensory ethnographic data. And this sort of is playing on what we heard in the last talk about those two initial senses of situatedness. So one of the ways that something can be situated is lived and embodied. And so when we think about, and when in our research team, one of the things that some of the members of the team have been doing has been to actually carry out the training program. And so then they attend to their own experience as they are also training to to administer the MoCA. And this is also a kind of situatedness. So what does it feel like to conduct the test, anticipating as you're you're reading the list of letters that the patient is going to tap an A, knowing that the J is going to sound so close in sound and time. How do our own bodies shift? Do our breaths get caught? Does that cue this kind of anticipation? And here again is this idea that we heard in the previous paper about the ways in which a measure of biomedicine is a part of a dynamic local environment where the materiality is intersubjective, relational, and contributes to the phenomena that's being studied. Now, bringing ourselves in as researchers, we might also ask, how do we know our field site differently now that we're part of this larger network of people ready to go out into the world and determine if missing items from a 5-item list are meaningful? So, research relating to the MoCA frequently makes reference to its testing domains as being more apt than other assessment tools as correlating with particular brain regions and types of cognitive function. And so making determinations relating to frontal versus temporal parietal neurodifference through the performance of the MoCA performs anatomization through the questions and the tasks. But since our project also asks about what happens when the strange, uncanny ephemeral experiences of brain trauma don't map, we're particularly interested in this embodied experience of the MoCA. And so to that end, one of the other ways I created this slide just to sort of give you a sense of visually some of these different kinds of articulations that are happening within the MoCA. But what I also want to do, and to think about with you just for a moment, if my slide will advance, there we go, is the way that we might also read across different kinds of texts when we're thinking about these articulations. And so we could read the MoCA against a poetics of mental and cognitive evaluation, looking to what it is that we know when we draw out relations across these divergent texts and different divergent kinds of readings, orienting ourselves to the situatedness of embodied knowledge. So this is another way of telling a story about those subtle changes, how they are lived by people with brain injury and their meaning. So in her work, In the Wake, Christina Sharp brings together very divergent texts, archival records, poetry, music, her own and others, memoirs, tracking repetition and mimesis within these to develop insights about the material and embodied afterlives of slavery and the indebtedness of contemporary social and cultural forms to the Middle Passage. So Sharp really shows very nicely how these synchronicities of words that are performed across stories and genres, create an interval where there's this liaison that can make something new appear. And it's sort of in this kind of divergent reading and reading across text that we can make something appear. And so this is another way of doing situated neurosciences. And so thinking with this notion of synchronicities then, I've got the poem, The Mental Status Exam, for you to see. And I wanted to spend just a few moments with this because the form of the poem, as you read it, really is hailing the MMSE. And the MMSE, remember, was that foil that was articulating with the MoCA. The poem's rhythm and temporality amplify the juxtaposition of assessment components. So count backwards from 100 down by sevens, remember these three things, with the questions that prompt issues of subjectivity, identity, and the existential implications of the examination. Practical ambiguity in the poem, so it's either sex or it's a box, release or pessimism. This enhances the kinds of juxtapositions that we have between lived experience and clinical assessment. And unlike clinical assessment, closure and resolution within the poem are simultaneously present and underdetermined. Campo's poem also draws us into this sensory, to the impossibility of bifurcated logics of brain, mind, subjective, objective. The looping and the tangentiality of it are part of its aesthetic appeal rather than being a clinical symptom. So when you read the mental status exam against the MoCA or against its articulation, the MMSE, you undo this linear narrative as the poem is sitting within but also exceeding its reference. And reading across genres, in this case, reading the technologies of neuroscience like the MoCA against a poetic rendering of one of its articulations is this other way to do situatedness, drawing forward the felt experience of neuroassessment in a way that's different, but maybe complementary to what we might think about it or how we might understand it in an ethnographic brain. So I've been looking at the MoCA, its articulations, the sensory experience of its use, some of the poetics of the articulating discourses, and from all of these multifarious readings and stories, what we have is also brain injury as a kind of multiplicity, where different stories, body-mind difference, are being held together held together in various kinds of ways, and they have a kind of unstable sort of articulation. But a certain kind of story is the one that tends to come forward within the neurosciences. And so by trying to look at all of the articulations and read across them, we resituate the experience in a broader context. So the notion of multiplicities proposes that for any seeming singularity, so an event, a disease, a concept, you have a range of tactics, events, and practices, images, and technologies, apparatuses that create the unification. They create the coherence of the multiple into the singular. So multiplicity invokes fluid associations and relations between different forms and potentialities. And so, like the concept of mess, thinking in terms of multiplicities makes reference to being able to attend to, be affected by, or make present the way that coordination and patching together of relations has to happen for this thing to seem like a singularity. So you have these provisional stable realities that are being textured in different kinds of ways. And so if we want to tell stories that stay with the messiness of experience, what we're doing is, we need to be thinking about how, when we're doing this, we are also world making. That if bodies and boundaries are emergent and being negotiated and provisional, our own activities of doing these different kind of readings are also adding to the messiness of experience, and that calls us into thinking about our practices as part of this kind of research assemblage. So our own methods and approaches are part of this world making, And this is more than contextualizing the research, and this is a lot more than reflexivity. So, and that might be something for discussion, but it sort of trying to have a reflexive method is not going to sort of address the way in which this world making and boundary shifting is happening as we're doing research as social scientists. But what it does call in is a way of thinking about making with. And so I think that is a really key point to thinking about doing situated neurosciences. And so, in the longer version of this paper, I talk a bit about assemblage, and also following Pam Aldred and Nick Fox, I talk about the research assemblage, which really can be defined in terms of the ways in which the affective relations of the research process itself are part of the event being researched. And that this is a key issue, I think, to be attending to from a science and technology studies standpoint if we want to do things in a situated kind of way. Because, as Nick Fox and Pam Aldred explain, the research assemblage can reveal how different research practices alter the affective flow and then alter what kind of knowledge is produced. And that really is sort of the point of a research practice that is trying to do these diverse kinds of articulations. So reading the poem against the MoCA is about having a different kind of affective flow and generating something new from it. So I'm going to wrap up there, I think, in the interest of us having a robust discussion. But the approaches that I've been thinking about aren't sort of social science approaches that can just be sort of tacked on to neuroscience as a nice way to make the neurosciences pleasant or sort of mobilize them in something way that's interesting to us. To do situated neurosciences, I think, is to think about how research assemblages and interdisciplinary intersectional readings are going to move across time and space. And so having these divergent and overlapping texts, images, songs, and ideas, things that are not normally read together but held in conversation, is a way of creating a resistant and recalcitrant interconnected story. And this is work that is about trying to be able to move out of also what in science and technology studies has been framed as the kind of colonial logics of the sciences. And so there's a lot of other examples we could think about how we stabilize sort of objects of inquiry within the neurosciences in relation to brain injury or otherwise. But what I think that I want to be able for us to end on is that if we're doing situated neurosciences in a way that is about telling different stories, then the neuroscientific practices that we're thinking about are going to have to be seen as offering partial truths, or what Arthur Frank would call truths in the telling, if they're not going to foreclose other ways of narrating experiences. And this is a very different kind of ontological framework for the sciences than what's typical. And in some instances, these ways of knowings may have been developed alongside and in relation to other stories that neurosciences themselves are telling, contributing to the neuroscientific practices, the data, and the understanding. But again, this is not the conventional way that neuroscience is done. Methods that are located within a conventional reductive materialism of neurobiological stories, and then the trappings of what's been called the neuromolecular gaze. These don't typically operate in a frame that stays with the mess or that sees the mess as integral to what is unfolding and what counts as data. But conventional approaches that are failing to see themselves as telling stories often do refuse to be read alongside other modes or other epistemes. And so these interdisciplinary, intersectional, and multisensory modes of studies are ones that can help us understand the sort of multiplicity in our realities and their locatedness, and try to understand things like data as being embedded in these in-between worlds that can be inhabited within and through competing and fluid ways of being. So staying with the messiness of the situated neurosciences, I think, can enable the production of meaningful knowledge without necessitating the erasure of other forms of knowing. And I think that as a kind of ethical orientation to doing the sciences, I would sort of posit as an invitation. And I'll stop there.